Hello, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about monopoly. Monopoly is a kind of market structure where there is a single producer of the product. We are going to talk about monopoly as opposed to perfect competition, which is characterized by a large number of buyers and large number of sellers. By talking about monopoly immediately after perfect competition, we can create a comparative scenario where we can see how the number of producers affect the kind of market interactions that takes place. In perfect competition, we looked at this idealistic market structure where there are a large number of buyers and sellers, and we found that the output that is being produced is socially efficient in the sense that the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is maximized. Under perfect competition, we will see that we are no longer in that idealistic world. Under monopoly, we will see that part of the welfare that market can generate is lost. But we have to understand that monopoly is a more realistic market structure than perfect competition, because in reality, there are monopoly markets, probably not as refined or as restrictive as the model that we're going to look at, but we can find some good examples about monopoly in real markets. So there is a strong motivation to really learn and study about monopoly. So let us start with the definition of monopoly. A monopoly is a firm that is the sole seller of a product without close substitutes. The idea of close substitute is critical to monopoly because under perfect competition, all the goods that all the firms were producing were homogeneous, meaning that they were all perfect substitutes. Because of the presence of perfect substitutes, none of the firms had any control or any market power in perfect competition. As opposed to perfect competition, in monopoly, since our firm produces a good for which it is the sole producer, and there are no apparent close substitute of the product that they are selling, our firm has real market power, meaning that it can influence the quantity it wants to sell, and it can also influence the price it wants to charge. Now, a typical question that we always encounter is, why do such kind of monopoly exist in reality? We can argue that monopoly exists as a result of two factors. The first factor that really gives rise to monopoly is the issue of having no close substitutes. And I think it makes perfect sense. If you are producing something which is unique, if you are producing something which cannot be substituted by any other good, you are automatically not facing any competition from anyone else. And if you are the sole producer of a unique good such as insulin, then you are in a market where you are the monopolist. The one that is, I guess, more realistic and more interesting is this issue of barriers to entry. So let us first define what barriers to entry means. Barriers to entry is basically a constraint that protects a firm from its competitors. So barriers of entry can be of many different kinds. We can talk about several different kinds of barriers of entry. The one that is the most common form of barriers of entry is called natural monopoly. Okay, and let's try to understand natural monopoly from a graphical perspective. Let's imagine that our economy wants to produce 4 million units of kilowatt hours of electricity. Electricity, by the way, is a classical monopoly example. So let's say that you have three options. You can have four firms, each of them producing 1 million worth of electricity hours. So if you do that, the average cost of each of these four firms are going to be $15. Since each firm is producing only one unit, they are sort of at the downward sloping part of their average cost. So as a consumer, if four firm is allowed to produce electricity in this market, each consumers are required to pay $15 for electricity. That's option number one. Option number two could be to allow two firms produce these 4 million units of electricity. Each firm will produce 2 million units, and according to their average cost, the price that each firm should charge is about 10. Now imagine a third option where instead of allowing two firms or four firms, you allow one firm to produce and supply for the entire market. If you allow 4 million output to be produced and supplied by a single producer, again, according to the long run average cost curve, we see that the average cost is much lower for this single firm. In previous chapters, we have defined this to be economics of scale. Economics of scale, which argues that in the long run, if you produce more, you tend to have a lower average cost of production. As you produce more, you expand your production, you buy machines, and you can sort of spread out your cost of production. As a result, average cost goes down with more production. So, if we allow one firm to produce and supply for the entire market, we can ensure that our firm can experience economics of scale. But the most important fact is that by achieving economics of scale, our firm, single firm, would charge a price which is $5, which is less than prices charged by market conditions where there are more than one firm. So it seems like in this kind of markets where economics of scale is important, it is better to have one firm produce in the market, charge a lower price, than have more than one firms operate there. These are markets which we call natural monopoly. Natural monopoly are the kind of monopoly that are natural in the sense that it is always beneficial from an economics perspective to create this kind of monopoly than have the market to be more competitive. Okay, so natural monopoly sometimes is one of the most common explanation or rationale for allowing monopoly to exist. The next one, again, a very intuitive source of monopoly is this control over key resources. So the best way to understand this is by looking at an example. So the example that we are talking about is De Beers. De Beers is as you all know, is a diamond producing company. De Beers owns almost 90% of the diamond mines around the world. Since De Beers have control over the key resource of uncut diamonds, natural diamonds from the market, from the world, it is natural to see that De Beers has a monopoly in diamond production. Okay, so that's issue number 2. The next factor that can give rise to monopoly is called network externality. This is a fairly new concept, and let me walk you through that. Now, let's first try to understand what network externality means. According to definition, network externality is a situation where the usefulness of a product increases the number of consumers who use it. A classic example, social networking like Facebook. So somebody created a good like Facebook, and the more the everyone likes the good and everyone tries to use that good. So the more people uses that good, the more network externality Facebook creates, and obviously Facebook just starts to have a monopoly in this market, and we clearly see that happening right now. But one could argue that other than natural monopoly, the most compelling case of monopoly that are being created in the economy is through government regulations of on entry. Okay, government probably is the creator of most of the monopoly markets around the world. In many cases, government issues rules and regulations that really create monopoly in an economy. This kind of monopoly, which is created by the government, is called legal monopoly. Legal monopoly is a market in which competition of entry and exit are prevented by the government through some kind of regulations. The examples of legal monopoly are many, and let's just walk over some of them because they are important. There can be two major kind of government regulations that can create monopoly. The first one is what we call patents, copyrights, license, and trademarks. I'm sure all of us are familiar with some of them or all of them. So what patents, copyrights, license, and trademarks do is that they give the producer of a certain good or a certain technology exclusive right of utilizing that good and exploiting that good in the market. Government is the only organization that can ensure patents, copyrights, licenses, and trademarks. And by providing these legal services, the government, really creates monopoly in the market. The other unique source of government regulations that create monopoly is called public franchises. I know public franchises are not that common in USA, but then there are countries where public franchises are pretty common. So what is public franchise? Public franchise are government owned companies that act like a monopolist and provide the good for the entire economy. The most common example of public franchise is government providing electricity or water supply to the population. So that sort of concludes our discussion about the various ways monopoly really exist in our economy. Okay. The next topic that we're going to look at is very important. We now want to understand, so far we have understood the reasons why monopoly exists. We probably also have learned a little bit about the kind of situation our monopoly firm is in. Our monopoly firm is in a good situation. They have market power. They can reduce reduce quantity. They can charge a higher price. They can have certain degree of control over the market. But we also have to understand that this control is not absolute control. So now what we're going to do is we are going to think about the pricing strategy of a monopolist, because our monopolist, just like any other firm, would like to maximize their profit, and their profit motive is going to define what kind of prices they are going to charge. In a general setup, we can really talk about two different kind of monopoly pricing. The first one is what we call a single price monopoly. A single price monopoly is probably the most common form of monopoly that we see around us, where the monopolist charges the same price for every unit of output they sell. So if you think about again De Beers, if De Beers sells 2,000 pieces of diamond bracelets, they're gonna charge the same price for every diamond bracelet they sell. As we're going to argue that there is another way a monopolist really can exploit his market power, and that is called price discrimination. Price discrimination is a kind of pricing strategy where the monopolist charges different price to different group or individuals based on their willingness to pay. The most common example of price discrimination is airliners. Airliners frequently charge different prices to different age group, like they charge lower price for senior citizens, lower price for students, or they charge different prices to different economic class, such as they charge a higher price for executives and so on. So we are going to look at both of them. Before we really start looking at single price and perfect price discrimination strategy, we need to also understand several basic aspects of how we are going to look at the monopoly market. Just like what we did in perfect competition, we need to first understand the graphical representation of a firm in a monopoly market. So we need to understand about the demand curve and the supply curve for the market and for individual firms. There is a big distinction between demand curve faced by a firm under monopoly and demand curve faced by a firm under perfect competition. Remember, we showed that under perfect competition, the single firm faces unlimited demand at the market equilibrium price, so the demand curve is basically a horizontal line. On the other hand, in case of a monopoly, a firm is actually the market, right? A firm is the sole supplier of good in the market. So a firm, the demand curve that our firm faces is also the demand curve for the market. What does that mean? It means that it is true that our monopolist can have captured the entire market demand, but our monopolist really cannot avoid the law of demand, which means that if our monopolist arrogantly charge a very high price, our monopolist will be forced to sell less and vice versa. So under monopoly, firms' demand curve and market demand curves are identical, which is downward sloping, and under perfect competition, a firm's demand curve is horizontal. They're very different. Let us now look at another graphical tools which are going to play a critical role in our discussion about pricing strategy, and that graph is called the marginal revenue graph. We are going to look at this sort of slowly, right? Let's start with the fact that our firm is facing this downward sloping demand curve, so please walk with me. And when the market price was 16, our monopolist was selling 2 units. When the market price went down to 14 units, our monopolist is able to sell 3 units. Now we should see something happening in terms of the trade-off our monopolist faces. When the monopolist is reducing the price from 16 to 14, our monopolist is losing part of the revenue that it was previously earning. So for the 2 unit it was selling at $16, by charging a lower price of 14, our monopolist really loses this pink rectangular area of revenue, which is 2 times 2, 4 million. But by charging a lower price, our monopolist also gains part of the revenue, which is the extra 1 million unit or 1 unit that they are selling, and this extra 1 unit really gives them 14 times 1, that's $14 worth of new revenue. So let us go back. By lowering the price, our monopolies therefore faces two effects. First of all, it faces a reduction in revenue from its existing sales, and it also faces an increase in revenue from the new sales that they are making. So the marginal revenue is going to be the net change in the revenue when prices go down or prices change. In this case, notice that when price goes down from 16 to 14, the net revenue is 14 minus 4, the one that they lost, and that is 10. So when price is 14, marginal revenue is 10. When price is 14, marginal revenue is 10. It should be clear that this will be the case for every output level the firm is producing and selling, and every price the firm is charging. So we can therefore argue that price will always be greater than the marginal revenue in case of monopoly. So if that is the case, the marginal revenue curve will always be lying inside the demand curve, like the one that you're looking at. The demand curve is the blue line, the marginal revenue curve is the yellow line. But I want to take us one step back and try to understand this issue of why marginal revenue will be greater than why price is going to be greater than marginal revenue from another perspective. Okay, and the perspective is kind of straightforward. So let's look at the explanation in B. So we know that our in order to maximize profit, our monopolist needs to equate marginal revenue with marginal cost. And we also need to understand that our firm wants to really charge a price which is greater than marginal cost. Why? Because first, our firm can do that. He has market power. And second, by charging a price higher than marginal cost, our firm can always ensure that they are earning profit. If we combine these two, we know that price has to be greater than or equal to marginal cost. And if marginal cost is equated with marginal revenue to maximize profit, we find that price is greater than marginal revenue for all the production decisions of our monopolist. So the graphical illustration that we saw about the monopoly market, where the marginal revenue curve stays inside the demand curve, makes perfect sense. Okay, with that idea, we are now going to move to the most important element of this chapter, which is to understand profit maximizing behavior of a monopolist under various kind of setup. We're going to start with the first setup, where our monopolist is a single price monopoly, and we will see that the profit maximization behavior of the monopolist is very similar. We should understand that for any firm, profit maximization really involves equating marginal cost with marginal revenue. Why? Because just like in a perfect competition, if the marginal cost is greater than if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, which is condition number A, we can see clearly that our monopolist, just like our firms in perfect competition, could have earned more profit by producing more. When marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, unlike our perfect competition, monopolist will simply not produce. Why? Because if marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, which means that at the margin a firm is making loss for every unit of output that they're selling, which doesn't really make sense, because if a monopolist really can secure exclusive right, he really wants to make profit. So the only equilibrium that we can see in this market is where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and that maximizes the profit of the monopolist. Okay, so that's something similar to perfect competition, but then we need to understand that monopoly is not perfect competition, because under monopoly, price is always greater than marginal revenue, which means that if marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, in monopoly we are gonna come up with a equilibrium condition where price is always going to be greater than marginal cost, and that will ensure to some degree that our firm really can earn profit. But does it? Can a firm, by charging a price over and above marginal cost, ensure that they are earning profit? The answer is no, they cannot. Let us try to understand that profit is basically an idea where the gap between total revenue and total cost is positive. So if we remember, profit is basically defined as total revenue minus total cost, where total revenue can be written as P times Q, and total cost can be written as average total cost times Q. So if we take Q common out of these two, we can write profit more concretely as P minus average total cost times Q, and that's what you see here. So basically your profit is going to be positive if P is greater than average total cost, right? Do you see that? If the term inside the bracket is positive, only then profit can be positive. So if price is greater than average cost, we are gonna have positive profit. If price is less than average total cost, we are going to have negative profit. Okay, so let's look at this from a graphical perspective now, because almost always it makes perfect sense to look at profit conditions from a graphical perspective. The picture that we're looking at, there are two of them, should give us a very good idea about how a monopolist can really ensure profit. So notice in the left side of the figure, equilibrium is found at the intersection between demand and supply. After you find the equilibrium quantity at the intersection between marginal cost and marginal revenue, I apologize, let me go back a little bit. In this market, in the first figure, profit is found, equilibrium is found where the marginal cost intercepts the marginal revenue. So that's actually the intersection point is this. And then after we find the equilibrium point, we go down and find the market equilibrium quantity, and we go up to the demand curve to find the market equilibrium price. So this is monopoly price, this is monopoly quantity, and at this quantity the average total cost is found by going up to the average total cost. So you see that this is average total cost, and you can see clearly that price is greater than marginal cost, and the area, the pink area, which is the area above the average total cost and below the market demand curve, is the profit of the monopolist. Why is the monopolist earning profit? Because our price is greater than average total cost. This is obviously not the only case that can happen. You can run into an unusual or rare situation where the market equilibrium price is found at the intersection between marginal revenue and marginal cost. We are now looking at the picture on the right, where the market equilibrium price turns out to be 10, but the average total cost at that output level is 12. So here average total cost is greater than price, and obviously our firm is going to earn loss, which is indicated by this red rectangle. So therefore we can conclude that profit maximization but by our monopolist by equating marginal cost with marginal revenue and by charging a price which is greater than marginal cost really does not guarantee that our monopolist is going to earn profit. Whether our monopolist is going to earn profit will depend on whether price is higher than average total cost or not. Okay, so the next concept that we are going to look at is so we are obviously going to look at pricing strategy under this so-called price discrimination. Before we do that, we want to maintain our discussion similar to perfect competition. So we want to talk a little bit about the supply curve of a monopolist. And it's a very interesting discussion because in perfect competition, we have learned that supply curve is this upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve over and above the average variable cost for the market. But in case of a monopolist really doesn't have a supply curve. Think about it. Think about this. A monopolist really chooses how much they want to produce based on the demand of the buyers. Right? A monopolist looks at how much output buyers are willing to buy, and then he figures out a price that is going to maximize his price, that is going to maximize his profit, and he just sets that. So the monopolist really does not have a supply curve. That's fascinating. Okay. Now, before we move on to the pricing strategy under perfect price discrimination, which is fascinating, we want to talk a little bit about the welfare gain or loss under monopoly. We have already seen that monopoly production and output decisions and pricing decisions are very different from the pricing decisions and the output decisions in perfect competition. It is natural to assume that our monopolist is going to charge a higher price than perfect competition because he can. And if he charges a higher price, obviously he will end up selling less than perfect competition. Now, this difference between the price and the quantity that monopoly charges as opposed to perfect competition has welfare consequences. Let's now look at the welfare consequences of perfect competition and monopoly. We're going to look at this in two steps. First, we are going to compare the output and price decisions under monopoly with perfect competition. And we have drawn a very intuitive graph here. And the single graph can be used to find out or identify the output and pricing decisions of both the monopolist and the perfect competition. Let's start with perfect competition. Under perfect competition, we know that the market equilibrium will be found at the intersection between the demand curve and supply curve. So we know that supply curve is marginal cost, demand curve is demand. We find price at the intersection between those two. So PC is the price under perfect competition. Notice that in perfect competition, individual demand is like a horizontal line, which is also equal to marginal revenue. So at point 1, we find perfect competition price and perfect competition quantity. On the other hand, under monopoly, we find equilibrium where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Remember, the marginal revenue curve for monopolist is downward sloping. Marginal revenue curve for our perfect competition is a horizontal line. Now at the equilibrium, we go up to the demand curve and we find monopoly price, which is PM, and we go down horizontally and we find the monopoly quantity. So what we see clearly that monopoly quantity is less than perfect competition quantity, and monopoly price is greater than perfect competition price. And it makes perfect sense because, as I mentioned before, that obviously our monopolist would charge a higher price than perfect competition, and obviously our monopolist will end up selling less than perfect competition. So we can therefore conclude that monopolist charges a higher price and produces lower quantity than perfect competition. This discrepancy in production and pricing decision obviously has welfare consequences. So the next task that we are going to do now is try to understand welfare loss under monopoly. And just like we looked at monopoly in the context by comparing it with perfect competition, we are going to do the same thing with the welfare calculation. So again, let us first calculate welfare under perfect competition. So welfare under perfect competition, okay. So let's call this welfare under perfect competition, PC. So under perfect competition, the price is PC, market price, and market quantity is QC. So we know that consumer surplus is always the area below the demand curve and above the market equilibrium price. So consumer surplus is basically the upper rectangle, which is rectangle 5, plus this smaller rectangle, we call it upper 4, because 4 really consists of 2. We are going to just look at the upper one, plus this rectangle which is called 7, right? So this rectangle which is called 7. So that's the consumer surplus, consists of 5, 7 and upper 4. Producer surplus under perfect competition is this trapezoid, so-called trapezoid. So trapezoid plus the lower 4, so plus this one. So that is my producer surplus under perfect competition. It has a trapezoid and it has this lower rectangle. So that's welfare under perfect competition. Now we want to understand welfare under monopoly. So under monopoly, our market equilibrium price is PM and our market equilibrium quantity is QM. So consumer surplus under monopoly is only the area 5, and producer surplus is a lot of stuff, right? The producer surplus is basically, as we know, the area below the market equilibrium price and above the supply curve. So what we are looking at is producer surplus. Let me sort of delete some of the perfect competition calculation, and then we are going to be able to look at producer surplus under monopoly. So under monopoly, our consumer surplus is basically area 5 and our producer surplus is the area below price and above the market supply curve. So this is area that and this one, so added together. So producer surplus is the rectangle 7 plus the trapezoid. Well, let's try to understand or compare consumer surplus under perfect competition, consumer surplus under monopoly. So under perfect competition, notice that consumer surplus under perfect competition was 5, upper 4 plus 7. Consumer surplus under monopoly is just 5. So under monopoly, our we have a loss in consumer surplus, first the upper part and then 7. Under perfect competition, producer surplus was the trapezoid and the lower 4. under monopoly, producer surplus is area 7 and the trapezoid. So notice that the trapezoid is common. Under monopoly, we see a new area 7 becoming part of producer surplus, which was part of the consumer surplus before. So what happens is that when we look at this rectangle, it is to be part of consumer surplus in perfect competition. Now it is part of producer surplus under monopoly. So there has been just a redistribution of surpluses. It's not an economic loss. What is lost from the economics perspective is the upper 4 of consumer surplus and lower 4 of the producer surplus. So it's this upper triangle and the lower triangle of 4 that is completely missing from the economics outcome. Why? The loss in consumer surplus comes from the fact that our consume buyers buy less and pay more. Both of them are inefficient from an economics perspective. Loss of producer surplus comes from the fact that our producer charges a higher price and produces less. So the second issue is very serious. As a case of monopoly, our producers really produce less than socially optimum level of production, which means that part of the resources of the economy are not really utilized. As a result, this rectangle that we are talking about, the rectangle 4, really measures the welfare loss under monopoly. We call it dead weight loss. So it is interesting to see that our monopoly really creates dead weight loss, and therefore our monopoly is not socially efficient. Is our monopoly fair? Now, in most of the cases, I am really reluctant to talk about fairness, because fairness is a complicated concept. We need to have a really good understanding about what fairness means. Fairness actually also is a normative question. But since we always want to talk about fairness when it comes to market conditions, I guess we can make some rudimentary statement about the fairness of monopoly. Based on what we understand about fairness, it should be clear that monopoly is not fair. Why? Because monopoly regularly redistributes welfare from the buyer to the seller. Seller gains, buyer loses. And monopoly is also not fair because it creates a deadweight loss. So monopoly is neither fair from individual consumer perspective, nor it is fair from an economics perspective. So that's very interesting. Now, another concept that we are now going to talk about is related with a single price monopolist, and that is been one of the focal point of industrial organization in the last 80 to 70 years, which is called this rent-seeking activity. So I'm going to start with defining what rent-seeking is. Rent-seeking is basically government appropriating part of the profit that monopoly earns. So everybody has enemies, So the monopolist's greatest enemy is the government, which sometimes actually grant them the monopoly power. Government does not really do that for free. Government also accepts bribe and appropriates part of that profit that our monopolist earns. Okay, so rent seeking refers to a mechanism through which government or some kind of regulatory body really extracts excess profit out of our monopolist. The outcome? As a result of a rent seeking activity, our monopolist will end up earning just normal profit, which is actually zero profit. Okay, how does that happen? The basic intuition here is very simple. Through rent-seeking activities, our rent seekers increase the cost of production by our monopolist, and raising cost of production really reduces our monopolist profit until we reach to a level where all the excess profit of the monopolist is exhausted and our monopolist is earning just zero or normal economic profit. We can understand this from a graphical perspective as well. Imagine that original supply car, original average cost of production was somewhere here, and at the market equilibrium price was PM. The average total cost, let's say, was less than the price. As a result, our monopolist was earning profit. This is excess profit or positive economic profit. Now some government agency comes to the monopolist and asks for bribe. They say that you have to pay us, otherwise we are not gonna guarantee that you have monopoly power. This kind of bribe or rent-seeking activity starts increasing the cost of production of our monopolist, so our average cost function really starts shifting upward until we reach a point like PM, where the average cost, so at PM what we see is that price is equal to average total cost, which is greater than marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So the first part of the condition, which states that price is equal to average total cost, really ensures that our firm is earning zero economic profit. Okay. Okay, so another point, and I think we should just look at it from the graph as well, is that the deadweight loss basically is this rectangle, and as you should see that the size of the deadweight loss really has gone up if you compare that with the previous situation where average cost was lower than the demand, lower than the price of the market. Deadweight loss was smaller. Why? Because through rent seeking, our part of the gain of our producer is really taken away from the economy, and producers also are part of welfare comparisons. So under rent seeking behavior, our producers lose more, and as a result deadweight loss is larger. Okay, let us now move to the second pricing mechanism under monopoly, which we call price discrimination, and this is a fascinating concept. Let's start with the definition. Price discrimination means selling a good or service at a number of different prices, which means that you want to sell different prices to different groups or individuals. It's not easy to do that. In order for you to be able to charge different prices to different individuals, you really first need to know what type of buyers and sellers exist, what type of buyers really exist. So you need to really have a good identifying mechanism, and also you need to make sure that whatever you sell to one person cannot be resold to another group, right? So by charging different price to different consumers, what our monopolist does is that they exhaust all the consumer surplus of our consumer. This situation could be very extreme, where none of the consumer surplus is left. When our monopolist can successfully exhaust or appropriate all the consumer surplus from the economy, we will call it perfect price discrimination. Perfect price discrimination arises when the monopolist charges different prices to different group of people, and he charges the maximum price. He charges a price which is equal to the maximum price that individual is willing to pay. In that way, all the consumer surplus is appropriated. Let's look at this price discrimination from a very intuitive graphical perspective. Let me first start with figure A. Okay. In figure A, in figure A, notice that a regular monopolist would charge where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. For the sake of in order to avoid complications in the figure, we have dropped the marginal revenue curve. Imagine that the price that the monopolist is charging, single monopolist is charging $12, and the quantity selling is 8. You can see that the light blue area is the profit that our regular monopolist would be earning. But now let's imagine that our monopolist is not satisfied with the level of profit it is making. So what it is doing, instead of charging $1,200 to every unit that it sells, our monopolist is picking 1, 2, 3, and 4 prices. It is charging $1,800 for one group. It is charging $1,600 to another group. It is charging $1,400 to another group, and finally it is charging $1,200 to another group. So with 1,800, 2 units of goods are sold to one group. With 1,600, another 2 units are sold to another group. With 1,400, another 2 units are sold to another group. And with 1,200, obviously there is another group, right? So notice that by charging 4 different prices, first of all, our monopolist gain some extra consumers, extra profit, which is indicated by this rectangle. The first rectangle indicates the profit earned by charging $1,800 to one group. The second rectangle measures the extra profit that our monopolist earns by charging $1,600 to second group, and the third rectangle measures the profit that our producer earned or monopolist earns by charging $1,400 to another group. So by charging different prices to different group, our monopolist gets the original's profit plus these 3 new areas as profit. Remember, these areas were part of the consumer surplus, but now they are part of the profit. If this process is efficient, meaning that every price is being charged to a consumer who is willing to pay that price. So to put it in a different way, a monopolist can identify each group and figure out what is the maximum price that they are gonna willing to pay according to their demand curve, and charges each good the price that the buyer is willing to pay. So by doing that, every element of this consumer surplus is now appropriated by our monopolist as profit. This is fascinating. So under perfect price discrimination, our monopolist's profit level is phenomenal, right? Our monopolist under perfect competition gets the original profit. It also appropriates part of the consumer surplus. It's not part of the consumer surplus, it's the whole consumer surplus. And there is a third thing that is going to happen. And before I talk about that, let me come back, okay, to the first one. So I'm going back and forth. Please stay with me. I'm going to delete this figure a little bit and try to get a better understanding about how much profit our firm is making when they are charging 4 different prices to 4 different people. So the original profit was this light blue triangle, which is 600, which is 1200 minus 6, 600 times 8. So that's like 48. So let's call it 4.8. That's a measurement of profit. Now profit under discrimination is 4.8 plus the 3 new areas that we have just collected. So the first area is 18 minus 12 times 2 plus 16 minus 14 times 2 plus 12 minus 12 times 2, right? So if you do your calculation, you will see that all the summation adds up to 4.8. So profit under original single price charging was 4.8. Profit under discriminatory price is 7.8. So it should be clear that under perfect price discrimination, price discrimination, profit is much higher. So there is a strong rationale for our monopolies to price discriminate. The issue about perfect price discrimination, which is the second figure, is also fascinating. When our monopolist can perfectly price discriminate, the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve becomes identical, which means that if you know who is willing to pay what, you are basically charging them according to the demand curve of the model, and each unit is giving you the revenue equal to the price. So in that case, our equilibrium will be found where the demand curve intercepts the supply, the marginal cost curve, and you should see clearly that under perfect price discrimination, the price is lower than regular monopoly, and the quantity that the monopolist is producing is 11, which is higher than the quantity that our regular monopolist was producing, which is 8. But it gets even more interesting. This 11 unit is found where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Think about it. Marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue is a condition that we saw in perfect competition. So in perfect price discrimination, our monopolist really produces the output that perfect competition was producing. This is fascinating, because if our perfectly discriminating monopolist is producing the output level that perfect competition was producing, that means our perfectly discriminating monopolist is socially efficient. There is no deadweight loss, and our perfectly discriminating monopolist is equally efficient like the perfect competition. The only exception between perfectly discriminating monopolist and perfect competition is that in perfect competition, what was the consumer surplus is now the profit of the monopolist. So by perfectly discriminating each consumer, our monopolist appropriates the entire consumer surplus from the market. Other than that, our perfectly discriminating monopolist is very similar to our perfect competition. So in the document, I actually show you actual calculation of how discriminating monopolist really increases the profit, and more importantly, how perfectly discriminating monopolist really leads to an output where there is no deadweight loss, and our perfectly discriminating monopolist could be economically efficient. That really concludes our discussion about monopoly. I will upload some questions in Blackboard, and you can take a look at those. And if you have any question, please get in touch with me. Thank you very much.